This is the TechteamKB. It's based on a GMMK Full Size using Glorious Panda switches, Razer PBT keycaps, and has both a custom paint job and a custom USB-C port, as well as a fancy coiled USB-C cable with an aviator connector that I paid way too much money for. If you want to see how I made it, we have to go back a few weeks. This is the Glorious Modular Mechanical Keyboard, or GMMK for short, and it's a great way to get into building your own keyboard. Now, sure, it's not the all-out get a custom case, PCB, switches, solder it all in. This is much, much simpler. This is a bare bones unit which comes with a PCB and a shell, and it's all fit to work just right. Now, I got the full-size version, which I know a lot of the people on r/mechanical keyboards think I'm an absolute heathen for that, but hear me out. I use my number pad on a daily basis. I like having a number pad on my keyboard, and it doesn't affect me in terms of the space or in terms of my shoulder spacing. I got this one. Cool? Perfect. The way this board works is pretty simple. Each of the key switch positions has effectively a little slot in them that lets you click the switches into place. Any cherry style switch should work, and the little pins on the back of them slide into little holders in the PCB, which then lets you use them as a key switch. It's really simple to do, and even comes with a switch puller in the box, so you can unplug them all and switch them all out later if you fancy. It even comes with a keycap puller built into the bottom of it, although I'll be honest and say that I'm not entirely sure how you're meant to get that off without another tool, but hey, it's there if you can access it. And speaking of the key switches, the ones that I'll be using are these Glorious Pandas. Now, I did want to buy some Boba U4Ts, but unfortunately they were out of stock everywhere. And one nice benefit of going with these Glorious Pandas is that OverclockersUK stocks both the keyboard and the switches, which they sent over, and I'll leave links to both of those in the description below if you're interested. The Pandas are a tactile switch. That's my personal preference. My main keyboard right now is a sort of OG Cherry MX Brown, and I like a tactile feel. Linear just feels kind of mushy to me. I like a tactile bump, but obviously not a blue style switch because those are annoying as hell. Now, the Pandas aren't quite the same in terms of their tactile feel as a Cherry MX Brown. These almost feel more like a rubber dome switch than they do a standard mechanical in their sort of feel and the give that happens when you reach that tactile bump and the actuation points. Now, as you can see, I clearly haven't had this together yet to test how they feel, but my initial impression is that they're rather nice, and I'm very much looking forward to having this done so that I can have a play on them, type on them, and game on them as well. So what's my plan here? Well, as you will have seen from the start of this video, the final product doesn't look a lot like this. So one of the jobs I have to do is to strip the keyboard down and paint this top plate. I need to sand it down, add some primer, and then add in the stripes and some clear coat so that I actually protect it rather than the last time I tried to do any painting of stripes. Now, that's one job, but the other one is solving a problem that I have with the GMMK in general, at least this full-size one, which is that the smaller TKL and 70% or however small it is, those have USB Type-C ports built onto them and removable USB-C cables. Now, that makes sense because those are the sorts of boards that you would be more likely to travel with, but this full-size one, well, it's got a hardwired USB cable, and it's honestly not the nicest, and if I want to make this a custom board, well, let's face it, I'm gonna make it properly custom. So I want to add 8 USB port or USB-C ports to it. I have a little breakout board and socket to add in, and what I'm gonna do is take the board apart to work out where I can physically fit this. I think it's gonna be in one of the corners, so the looks at the bottom of it, and then cut a hole. I also want to 3D print a little sort of housing that this will secure to, so that I can both paint it so that it looks good, but also give a little bit of support and rigidity rather than just pressing this through the body and leaving it like that. So the very first thing I did when I got the keyboard was actually disassemble it. I wanted to see if it was even feasible to attach a USB-C port to the keyboard at all, and my first thought was to install it where the existing cable came out, the same place that my Coolmaster Master Keys Pro L keyboard has its USB port, sort of under the center. Unfortunately, in this keyboard's case, the cable routing is a bit too tight. The sort of channels where your cables can be routed out of is a bit too close to the port, and so I didn't think that I'd be able to put a USB-C port there and still be able to connect a cable afterwards. So the next best thing is cutting a hole in it. So I was looking for a different place and decided that one of the two corners would be the best shout. Now I knew that I wanted the port to protrude out of the back of the keyboard to both make it easy to actually connect to, also to have a bit more stability, but I didn't want it to just be sticking out. I wanted some way to tie it in nicely to make it look a bit more like it's a genuine edition or a genuine design of the keyboard, rather than something that I've, hacksawed into it. So what I did is jump into Fusion 360 and design a little housing or a little cover based on measuring the USB-C port with my digital calipers, and effectively designed a little round housing that should fit over it quite nicely. I cut an angle in the back that I eyeballed the measurement of roughly how the sort of angle of the back of the keyboard, and went to my Elegoo Mars 3D printer. It's a resin printer, which is great for this sort of tiny little print, and printed one out. Unfortunately, the angle I picked wasn't quite right, so I went back and made a few additions, both to the angle and added a couple of grooves on the inside so that when I end up gluing the port on, there's a bit of area for the glue to sit in and sort of congeal into nicely. So back to the 3D printer we go, and it printed out beautifully. I do like to give my resin prints a wash in isopropyl alcohol, which, yes, I keep a tub of that in my fridge. Very handy. And then once it's dried, you then want to let it cure either in the sun or with UV light. My UV flashlight's batteries were dying, so I ended up leaving it on the windowsill in the sun for half an hour or so, and then that was it ready to go. The next step was installing the USB ports. I marked out and measured out exactly where I wanted the port to be. I gave little markings, and then I used my drill bit to drill out a couple of holes on either side of the port, and then used files to file a nice round shape. I ended up having to file out the space to let the port through a little bit more, as the drill bits I were using were 3mm, whereas the USB-C port was around 3.2. That was deliberate. I wanted to be able to file away and get a very nice and clean surface, and it ended up pretty nice. The next step was custom making a cable to go from the USB-C port that I'd bought to the board inside. Now, in theory, the connector that they use on the keyboard is a JST 2.54mm pitch connector, but I don't think that's quite right. And the reason is I bought a pack of JST 2.54mm pitch connectors, and they do not fit. They're small, the pins that they use on the board are smaller. So what I ended up doing, as I couldn't find anything useful, is to take the sort of standard jumper cables that you get for Raspberry Pis and Arduinos, strip off the block connector, as that made it impossible to fit all 5 pins on, and then put some heat shrink over them so that they're nice and insulated from each other, and then slid those on. Interestingly, this keyboard uses both a voltage ground or power ground and a signal ground, which USB, at least USB 2, doesn't have. It only has power and ground. So what I did was twist those wires together and then soldered both of them to the ground pads, as well as the data positive and negatives and the 5-volt supply. Then finally it was time to glue the port into the hole that I'd cut. That was relatively easy, although it did take a couple of days of letting glue dry and then testing it out. It still moved a bit, putting some more glue in, letting it dry and testing it out again. But the end result is a relatively sturdy, although I'm not going to test it too hard, USB-C port that you can plug in and out without too much problem. Next is the painting of the top plate. This was absolute hell. I am not someone who's very good at painting, and I also have ADHD, which means I have no patience. So me trying to paint things, especially not just a single color, but 3 different colored lines, didn't go very well. My first instinct was to just dry the paint with paintbrushes and liquid paint, but unfortunately that dried way too thick and way too unsmooth. I guess I probably could have used a paint roller, maybe, but it still would have been way too thick. So I ended up having to sand all of that back to bare metal, then do a full fresh primer coat. Then I put my tape stripes over and started painting with spray paint. Now that was fine, except I messed up a couple of times, and so I tried to sand back some of my errors. And when I sanded it back, I ended up sanding some of the tape away, so when I went to peel it off, it contaminated the surface, and again I started from scratch. I think I ended up painting this keyboard 4 or 5 times almost in full. So that's the level of dedication I had to try and get this even remotely good, and as you can probably tell, it's still not perfect, but it's about as good as I'm gonna get it with a box outside in my garden and some spray paints and some tapes, so that'll do for me. What I ended up with is a trifecta of colors, a light blue, a darker blue, and then what ended up being a sort of bronze metallic orange, which I do quite like. It's actually Ford Electric Orange as an automotive spray paint. In fact, all of these are automotive spray paints. And it freckles or speckles in the lights, and I do quite like it. I did also clear coat the entire thing with some clear lacquer, and that has protected it just a little bit. So that is the process, but here's the important bit. Here's how the keyboard sounds. And of course, I couldn't build a custom keyboard without playing some games on it, so let's have a quick play. So as always, we're playing some CSGO, and this clacky boy is up and running. I'm really glad that my USB-C port addition actually works, and it is quite nice to have my my fancy aviator connector coiled cable working as well. And yeah, the feel of these keys, the Pandas, are definitely different to the standard tactile switch that you might be used to, the sort of cherry style, so cherry brown essentially. I can't quite explain it. It almost feels more like a rubber dome switch that's caving in and giving way rather than an immediate tactile bump. It's hard to describe. It does feel good though, which is strange because normally let's say rubber dome switches aren't my favorites, but I am liking it. It has a definitely has a clack to it. It's definitely louder than my my standard keyboard, but with time and with lube, that will that can be resolved. And they're all here. Ran away. Come on, reload. Yes. 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 I can't believe I did that. I mean, I know they're bots, but like, I can't believe I did that. Oh dear. I did have a bit of trouble getting the stabilizer sorted. They are now much better. I think I got a bit of paint in the way, but I've reinstalled the stabilizers and bloodied my thumb a few times, and they now work. So that's good. They definitely bounce back well. The spacebar is still a little slow to return sometimes, but again, with some more lube, I think that will fix it. Sweet. Well, that'll do. very clacky. Overall, I'm really happy with the results. Yes, it's not perfect, the paint is far from it, and the USB port isn't perfectly square on and all that jazz, but overall, considering this is the first mechanical keyboard I've built myself, even if it is from a kid, the first good or even moderately okay painting job I've done, overall, yeah, like I said, I'm pretty happy. I will still be lubing up the stabilizers as I had a bit of trouble with those. They're still a touch sticky, and I may end up lubing the switches if I feel so that way inclined, but for now, I'm pretty happy with it. I'm going to be trying it as my new daily driver, and I'll let you know how that goes. And if I don't end up using that, I'll use it for my test desk or up here for filming. One way or another, it'll be getting used. I want to say a big thank you to OverclockersUK for the keyboard and the switches. If you want to check those parts out or pick them up yourself, I'll leave links to Overclockers in the description where you can pick them up. I ended up buying the cable, the paints, and the keycaps myself, so I'll leave links to where I got those in the description down below as well if you're interested. All of those links are likely to be affiliate links except for the cable. It's a really nice custom one. I'll leave that store where I got it from down there. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Feel free to let me know what you think of my first attempt at very much customizing and building a mechanical keyboard. Is this something you would build yourself? Would you go for the TKL or smaller versions instead? Anything at all, let me know in those comments down below. Of course, there are plenty of other videos on the end cards you can check out if you fancy keeping watching. There's of course that subscribe button and soon to be the new YouTube join button for YouTube memberships if you're interested, or Patreon if you want to get access to our Money Min Discord chats, which are the lovely people, specifically Essentialist, who convinced me to come and do this and was giving me oodles of support along the way. So if you want to join that group and see the early access teasers and that sort of stuff, then feel free to join there. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.